183 miles southeast of Okinawa, U.S. Navy carrier Strike Group 5 cut through the rolling waters of the Western Pacific. Its flagship, the USS George Washington, was a whirlwind of activity with a constant train of aircraft arriving and leaving the deck. The tightly choreographed, dangerous and exhaustively drilled dance was all in support of the day's critical and consequential operation. Inside the GW's Combat Direction Center, a space nicknamed the Library for its quiet concentration, Rear Admiral Richard Ward eyed the progress of what was being called Operation Steadfast Tide. Ordered by Indo-PACOM and ultimately the US President, Steadfast Tide's objective was to escort civilian shipping into Taiwan, thus breaking China's quarantine of the island. Its success was intended to delegitimize China's action and to pressure Beijing into ending the quarantine that was viewed internationally as an illegal act of aggression. 350 miles to the west of the GW, the first convoy of Steadfast Tide was making its way for the port of Kaohsiung. In less than an hour, it would be crossing into the quarantine zone. What then? Was an open question. In Beijing, the initial response to news of the operation was blunt, stating, "The US must respect China's sovereignty and cease meddling in China's internal affairs. Doing otherwise will force needless escalation, requiring a strong response." Behind the scenes, General Li Busheng, the architect of the quarantine, held a contentious meeting with President Liu Hao, who was demanding military force if the convoy defied the quarantine. After a lengthy discussion, General Li persuaded the president that with both sides wishing to avoid war, the best approach was to harass and delay the convoy, but ultimately allow passage if it persisted. Said the general, "Every day the Americans have to spend time, effort and budget escorting every ship into the quarantine is a day their political support erodes. We can afford it. They cannot." Reluctantly, President Liu Hao accepted the plan to use every available means to obstruct the convoy, short of direct military action. In Washington, D.C., the Dalman administration publicly emphasized that Operation Steadfast Tide was aimed at ensuring freedom of navigation, while showing a strong and sustained commitment to its friends and allies in the region. Behind the scenes, confidence was high that the operation would prove successful, given that the Chinese had shown a reluctance to attack US-manned military units directly, and as one advisor put it, they are not looking to get into a scrap with the United States. Breaking through the quarantine would, in Washington's estimation, take all the wind out of the PRC's sails. Back aboard the GW, Rear Admiral Ward, the architect of Steadfast Tide, hoped that was true, but was prepared, if not. Meanwhile, with the convoy closing in on Taiwan, all under a torrent of media coverage likened to that of a pre-game event, the world watched, waited, and held its breath for what came next. The first convoy of Operation Steadfast Tide, identified as Combined Task Force 173, consisted of 11 ships organized into two columns. The western column, led by the Australian Anzac-class frigate, HMAS Stuart, was escorting 3 civilian cargo ships, followed by a Flight 1 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS Fitzgerald. The eastern column was led by the French Aquitaine-class frigate, Provence, with 3 trailing cargo ships, followed by the task force's flagship, a Flight 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS John E. Kilmer. Trailing the convoy was a late-hour addition to the combined task force, that of a Polish corvette, the ORP Kaszub, which had been offered up after her counter-piracy mission in the Indian Ocean had finished in the previous weeks. The Kaszub's insertion into the mission was Poland's way of returning a favor to the Americans, but more so, to deter them from deprioritizing the war taking place on Poland's eastern border. The multinational makeup of the convoy was intentional, meant to politically complicate any Chinese response, while showing a united international front. The civilian cargo ships, some of which had been diverted to a holding pattern near Manila with the sudden quarantine of Taiwan, were also carefully chosen for their country of register and their cargo, consisting primarily of food, fuel, and medical supplies. At 22:40 local time, the convoy crossed into the quarantine zone approximately 83 miles south of Kaohsiung. Leading the convoy from aboard the USS John E. Kilmer, Commander Richard Hightower felt the crossing to be almost anticlimactic. He'd expected a stronger initial response. Instead, China's interference was, so far, unexceptional, with radio warnings and maritime militia ships cutting across his convoy's path. The most aggressive move had been a low pass by 3 H-6 bombers. It was little more than what Hightower had experienced from the PRC in past freedom of navigation operations. He hoped that trend would continue on into Taiwan. It did not. 40 miles from the coast, radar tracking showed that the maritime militia and Chinese Coast Guard ships were noticeably withdrawing, replaced with naval warships. Hightower suspected the reason was to remove the lesser disciplined units to avoid errors, or so he hoped, and that it was not a prelude to an attack. Whatever the case, the presiding belief was that the changeover likely meant the PLAN had more aggressive moves to come. To that, Hightower was not a fan of the restrictive rules of engagement that had been placed upon his task force, which required that he only fire if being effectively fired upon. He wrote in his journal, "It feels like they want me to take the first hit and then judge if I was right after the smoke clears." He was also concerned about the late-stage addition of the Polish corvette to the convoy. In a message to the 7th Fleet Director of Maritime Ops, he wrote, "The Kashzub is also concerned. They were trained for a counter-piracy mission and are now being pulled into multi-ship convoy duty. There are going to be integration issues, but we're working the problem." Hightower understood the political point of their being there, but the last-minute addition also added risk and complexity. And with 5 Chinese warships slipping into position near his convoy, he had all the risk and complexity he needed. At 03:50 local time, with the convoy just 20 nautical miles south of Kaohsiung making 14 knots, China, as predicted, began ramping up their aggression, with 2 of the nearby Type 054A frigates darting into the convoy's path, firing star shells, laser dazzlers, and chaff to muddy the convoy's night vision. Next came scores of low-flying UAVs passing dangerously close to task force warships, the drones originating from a nearby Type 052D destroyer. Soon after, a single Type 056 corvette dashed in toward the rear of the convoy as though to ram the ORP Kashzub. Only after the USS Fitzgerald charged at the smaller ship, targeting the corvette's bridge with its own non-lethal low-power laser dazzler, did the corvette finally turn away. Watching it all from HMAS Stuart, Warrant Officer David Lawton later wrote, "In daytime we weren't bothered by their bull, but at night it wears on your nerves pretty f***ing quick." Inside the Kilmer's CIC, the mood was tense, with the crew tracking a multitude of concerning or outright dangerously maneuvering contacts. Though there was no direct weapons threat, the PLAN's aggressiveness was plainly ticking ever upward, as the nautical miles to the convoy's destination ticked ever downward. In the moment, Commander Hightower saw his primary task, aside from preventing his convoy from being rammed, was, quote, "keeping all our horses in the barn," meaning keeping weapons tight. At 03:56 local time, that endeavor failed. It began with the return of the same 3 Chinese H-6 bombers that had conducted a low pass earlier, this time approaching the convoy from behind at 350 miles per hour. In a long trail formation, the first bomber screamed overhead at just 300 feet over the water. As it reached the convoy's midpoint, it fired off a volley of flares, the shells so low, some were seen bouncing off the cargo ships. Aboard the Polish corvette, the air defense crew operating the ship's close-in weapon system saw the bomber, the flares, and with the sudden boom of the second bomber passing overhead, mistook it all for a bombing attack. The crew activated their weapon to autonomously target, track, and fire on the attackers. The weapon turned its attention to the last incoming bomber and sent a stream of high-explosive fire that tore into the aircraft at point-blank range, severing a wing before sending it fireballing into the sea. Aboard the Kilmer, confusion reigned. "Who fired?" roared Commander Hightower. "Who the hell is firing?" In the speed and confusion of the moment, the facts about who fired first were conflicted and unclear. The ORP Kashzub was emphatic that they'd responded to a bomb attack. The USS Fitzgerald argued that the Kashzub fired first in error. But there was no time for debate. Seeing the tracers and the H-6 bomber spiraling in, the Chinese corvette, believing a fight underway, panic-fired and launched 2 torpedoes at its closest threat, the Kilmer, less than 2,000 yards away. The destroyer attempted to maneuver hard to starboard to break the solution, but it was too late. Though one torpedo missed, the second struck the starboard side engine of the Kilmer, the explosion tearing a 6-foot hole in the ship, killing 3 crew members. The damage to the ship was significant, with its main reduction gear thrown off its mount, leaving the shaft hopelessly damaged, along with major flooding. While damage reports cascaded in, Hightower furiously radioed the task force and the Chinese units to cease fire. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining H-6 bombers had circled wide, using the time to program a retaliatory strike against what they mistakenly believed to be the original aggressor, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS Fitzgerald. "Vampire! Vampire!" came the shout from the radar watch. 8 inbound, 7 miles, bearing 113. The situation was now beyond repair, with the rules of engagement met. Hightower gave the order to fire on all identified Chinese air and surface units. He then issued an urgent radio call to the USS George Washington announcing, "Riptide, riptide, riptide." Aboard the GW, Rear Admiral Ward received the message. The translation for the assigned code word was simple: bring everything. Within minutes, over 100 combat aircraft were in the air, with more scrambling from the Basa Air Base in the Philippines, along with support aircraft from as far away as Guam and the Yokota Air Base in Japan. Meanwhile, the waters off Kaohsiung sparkled and flashed as the warships of Task Force 173 opened up on their new targets with deck guns, surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles. For a brief moment, there was confusion aboard the Chinese warships, with the Americans shouting over the radio to hold fire, yet were now actively firing. The order was quickly given to attack. An officer aboard the Fitzgerald described what came next. "With all of us in such close proximity," he said, "it was like having a gunfight in a broom closet. The violence was short, swift, and brutal, and none of us were getting out of it unscathed." As Task Force 173 defended against the incoming fire, in quick succession, the Chinese air and surface units were struck. The corvette was quickly torn apart and eventually sunk by the near point-blank pounding of the Kilmer's deck gun, while the Chinese destroyer and 2 frigates were hit by a fatal combination of Exocet, naval strike missiles, and gunfire. Aboard the Kilmer, Hightower felt the rumble of the SAMs leaving his ship, the missiles joined by others from the Fitzgerald and the Kashzub, all racing to intercept the inbound anti-ship missiles and the bombers that sent them. 5 of the 8 missiles were destroyed, while 3 were seduced away from the Fitzgerald by a missile decoy. It saved the Fitzgerald, but the diversion sent the missiles to new targets less than 5 seconds later. One struck the rear-most container ship in the eastern column, the US-flagged Missouri Express. Burying itself into the containers, the missile delivered no initial structural damage, but ignited the contents of several containers, sending flames high into the night. But the worst was yet to come. The remaining 2 missiles slammed into the port quarter of the Johnny Kilmer, with each 365-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead tearing great gaping holes into the ship. 16 sailors died instantly in the conflagration, with twice that number wounded. In the CIC, Hightower heard a muted crump and felt the ship give a shudder. It was a deceptively minor sensation for what would be, in reality, a mortal blow to the multi-billion-dollar warship. The second engine room was now lost, the ship dead in the water, the combat system nearly completely disabled. Worse, without sufficient power, the operating pumps could not keep up with the flooding or the fires that were spreading and intensifying. While crewmen fought the fires and moved wounded to the deck, overhead the first aircraft from the GW arrived, only to find the nearby Chinese air and surface units rapidly pulling away in hopes of de-escalating the fight. As F-35 pilot Captain Joe Roldan later remarked, seeing the Kilmer burning with no approved targets, "We were all pretty furious and disappointed having to go home, empty-handed." With the immediate fight seemingly over, Hightower then made the decision to send the cargo ships on their way alone, to make the last dozen miles to the port of Kaohsiung. The mission of getting the civilian ships into Taiwan was over. Soon after, with the Kilmer beginning to list, the fire uncontrolled, and knowing that his air cover was a perishable asset, Hightower faced the grim reality. At dawn, he gave the agonizing order to evacuate the ship. While helicopters airlifted injured crewmen, the ORP Kashzub moved in alongside the crippled destroyer, allowing crossing with the luck of calm seas. Commander Hightower was the last to make the jump. To ensure the destroyer did not fall into Chinese hands, nor remain a spectacle for news coverage, once the ship was evacuated, the guns of the Fitzgerald, Stuart and Provence opened fire, finishing what the missiles and torpedo had not. At 0600, with the remaining warships of Task Force 173 turning east at best speed toward the safety of the GW strike group, the bow of the Johnny Kilmer finally slipped below the surface. Watching it go down, Hightower later wrote, "Was like experiencing a loved one die. That image and feeling will never leave me." By midday, the dreadful tallies were made. The US and its allies suffered 19 sailors dead, 35 wounded, the loss of the USS John E. Kilmer, along with various levels of damage to the frigates Provence, Stuart, the Kashzub, and the USS Fitzgerald, along with severe damage to the container ship, the Missouri Express. For its part, China lost 283 sailors and airmen, along with a destroyer, 2 frigates, a corvette, and 3 bomber aircraft. News of the losses shocked both sides of the Pacific. Shock that quickly turned to fury. Where that fury was directed next would change the course of history. Coming up in the next episode, fateful decisions are made as China and the US mobilize for war. If you enjoy this series, please send me a YouTube thanks, or join the Flat Circle History Patreon site, where you'll get behind-the-scenes access, commercial-free episodes, and tons of member-only content. Plus, it will help out John, the guy who makes this series possible. You can also now purchase Flat Circle History merchandise at John's website at forsberg.com. Lastly, a shout-out to my subject matter experts for this episode, including Michael Hilliard of the Red Line podcast, Darth Rust, Fix Edit, and a few others who shall remain anonymous. And as always, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And thanks for watching.